My son handed me a life jacket with a smile on his face. He said, "Dad, this trip is for you. You deserve this." I believed him. I had no reason not to. He was my blood. He was the boy I had raised alone after his mother walked out. He was the one I had sacrificed 20 years of my own life to put through school, to build a future for, to love without condition. I sat in that boat on that cold lake surrounded by nothing but trees and water and silence, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. That was before he took the boat. That was before I realized there was no cell signal, no path back to shore, no shelter, and no food. That was before I understood that the trip my son had planned so carefully, the one he had convinced me to take, the one he had mapped out down to the last detail, was not a gift. It was a disposal. He needed me gone. He needed me declared dead. And he needed it to happen before the end of the month, before the trust in my name could be reviewed, before the lawyer I had quietly hired could finish reading the documents my son had already started signing behind my back. If you have ever trusted someone with your whole heart and watched them use that trust to try to end your life, stay with me. Because what happened next, and what I did when I finally made it back, changed everything. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something honest. If your own child, the one you gave everything to, looked you in the eye and pretended to love you while quietly making arrangements for your death, what would you do when you found out the truth? Would you stay quiet to protect the family name? Would you confront them and give them a chance to explain? Or would you do what I did, collect every single piece of evidence, stay completely calm, and let the law handle the rest? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And if you have ever been betrayed by someone you raised or someone you loved like family, stay until the very end of this story. Because this one is for you. I want to start by telling you who I was before all of this happened, because the man I was matters. It explains why I stayed loyal too long, why I gave too much, and why it took a near-death experience in the middle of a wilderness lake to finally force me to see the truth I had been quietly refusing to look at for years. My name is Noah. I am 61 years old. I am a retired civil engineer who spent 32 years designing bridges, roads, and water systems for a mid-sized firm in the Pacific Northwest. I am not a dramatic man. I am not a man who looks for conflict or makes noise or needs to be the center of attention. I am the kind of man who fixes things quietly, who keeps his word, who shows up. I was raised to believe that loyalty and patience were the highest virtues a man could have. My father believed that. His father believed that. I believed it too. That belief cost me almost everything. My son's name is Daniel. He is 34 years old. He is tall, good-looking, and charming in the way that people with no real warmth learn to be. He learned early that his smile could move mountains, that his voice could calm any room, and that his ability to appear grateful and loving was a tool as useful as any other. I know that now. I did not always know it. I raised Daniel alone from the time he was 9 years old. His mother, my wife of 11 years, left us for a colleague she had been seeing for most of our marriage. She did not fight for custody. She moved across the country and built a new life that Daniel and I were not part of. I do not say this to make you feel sorry for me. I say it because it explains why I wrapped my entire identity around being Daniel's father. He was my reason. He was the project I poured everything into. Every overtime hour I worked, every weekend I gave up, every personal goal I deferred, I told myself it was for Daniel. It was for his future. It was for the life I wanted him to have. Daniel graduated from a good university. I paid for it. He started a small landscaping business in his late 20s. I lent him the money to get it off the ground. He bought a house at 31. I co-signed the loan because his credit at the time was not strong enough on its own. I did all of this without resentment. I did it because that is what fathers do. At least that is what I believed. What I did not pay close enough attention to was the pattern underneath all of it. Every time Daniel came to me for money or support, he came with a story that made me feel I was the solution to an emergency. There was always a crisis. There was always something that would fall apart without my intervention. And every time I stepped in, every time I solved the problem, Daniel would be warm and grateful for a few weeks, and then he would drift back to distance. He would stop calling. He would cancel dinners. He would go quiet for months at a time. I told myself it was normal. I told myself grown men pull away from their fathers. I told myself I did not need constant connection. I just needed to know he was okay. Looking back now, I understand that I was being managed. I was being kept at a comfortable distance until I was needed again. The trouble really started about 18 months before the fishing trip. That was when my doctor told me I had a heart condition. It was not immediately life-threatening, but it was serious enough to require medication, lifestyle changes, and regular monitoring. My doctor was honest with me. She said that with proper management, I had many good years ahead. But she also said that without care, the condition could become dangerous quickly. I told Daniel about my diagnosis. I told him in person over a dinner I had invited him to at my house. I watched his face carefully as I explained what the doctor had said. He nodded. He asked a few questions. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said, "Dad, I'm going to take care of you. You took care of me my whole life. It's my turn now." I felt something in my chest that was not my heart condition. It was hope. It was the hope that this diagnosis, as frightening as it was, might finally bring my son back to me in a real way. Instead, over the next several weeks, something shifted in Daniel that I could not quite name. He started coming around more, but it felt different. He started asking questions about my finances, my savings, my property. He asked to see the paperwork on my house. He asked whether I had updated my will recently. He asked about the investment accounts I had been building since I was in my 30s. I gave him honest answers because I had nothing to hide and because I assumed he was asking out of concern. I assumed he was trying to understand my situation so he could help me plan. That was my mistake. A few months after my diagnosis, Daniel suggested I speak with an estate attorney he knew. He said it was time to get everything in order, to make sure my wishes were clear, to protect my assets. He made it sound like a gift he was giving me, a son taking charge, being responsible, handling the hard conversations so his sick father did not have to. I agreed. I should have found my own attorney from the start. But I agreed, and that single decision handed Daniel more information about my financial situation than I ever intended anyone to have. The attorney was a man named Gerald Marsh. He had a small office in a town about 40 minutes from where I lived. I met with him twice. He was pleasant enough on the surface, but there was something about the way he asked his questions that felt slightly off balance. He pushed certain topics harder than others. He asked about life insurance multiple times. He asked about the timeline of the trust I had established years earlier. a trust that had been set up to distribute my assets to Daniel upon my death, but which also included a clause that allowed me to revise it at any time while I was living. He seemed very interested in that clause. He asked when I had last updated it. He asked whether I was planning to update it soon. I left both meetings feeling vaguely uncomfortable, but I could not put my finger on why. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that estate attorneys always asked these kinds of questions. I told myself that Daniel had good intentions and that I was letting my own emotional distance from him cloud my thinking. It was around this time that I started having conversations with my neighbor, a retired woman named Margaret who had lived 2 doors down from me for over 15 years. Margaret was sharp, warm, and had a habit of noticing things other people missed. She had seen Daniel come and go over the years. She had watched us at the distance of a good neighbor who never pried but never missed much either. One afternoon, Margaret came over to return a pot she had borrowed. She sat down for coffee, and after a few minutes of ordinary conversation, she said something that stayed with me for a long time. She said, "Noah, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I've noticed that lately when Daniel comes to your house, he always parks in your driveway, walks around the exterior of the house before he comes in, and spends a lot of time looking at things. The garage, the back fence, the roof, like he's assessing it." She paused. "I don't know what that means, but I wanted you to know." I thanked her. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen for a long time thinking about what she had said. I told myself there were reasonable explanations. Maybe Daniel was worried about the property's condition because I was getting older. Maybe he was thinking about repairs I might need help with. I found an explanation that was generous, and I chose it. That was the version of me that existed 18 months ago. The version of me that existed after the fishing trip was a different man entirely. The fishing trip was Daniel's idea. He proposed it about 6 weeks before it age. Append, he called me on a Sunday morning, which was already unusual because Daniel almost never called unless there was something he needed. He was cheerful and warm in a way that I recognized, but had learned not to trust completely, though I was still not willing to act on that distrust. He said he had been thinking about how little time we had spent together since my diagnosis, and that he wanted to make up for it. He said he had found a remote lake about 4 hours north of the city, accessible only by a logging road and a short boat launch, surrounded by national forest. He said it was the kind of fishing that our grandfather used to talk about, wild and quiet and far from everything. I felt the pull of it immediately. The idea of my son wanting time with me, real time, away from phones and obligations and the tension that had settled between us like furniture we had both stopped noticing. It was everything I had been quietly wanting for years. I said yes. I did not hesitate. Over the following weeks, Daniel handled everything. He researched the location. He rented the boat. He packed the supplies. He created a detailed plan for the drive, the launch, the campsite. He shared none of the specifics with me, telling me only that it was a surprise and that I just needed to show up and enjoy it. I told myself this was Daniel finally stepping up. This was my son finally giving back. I should have noticed that a man planning a genuine gift for his father does not typically keep all the details secret. The morning of the trip was a Thursday in late October. The drive was beautiful. The leaves had turned and the road wound through country that felt entirely separate from the world I normally lived in. Daniel drove and talked about his business, his plans, his thoughts about the future. He was relaxed and talkative in a way I had not seen in years. I remember thinking that this was what I had always wanted. This version of my son. Present, engaged, genuine. We reached the lake by early afternoon. It was remote, exactly as he had described. The logging road ended at a gravel clearing beside a narrow boat launch. There was no one else around. The lake itself was wide and still and ringed by dense forest on all sides. Daniel unloaded the boat, a medium-sized aluminum fishing vessel he had rented from an outfitter 2 towns over. He set up the rods, organized the tackle, loaded the cooler. He was efficient and capable, and I felt proud watching him work. We fished for about 2 hours. The afternoon light was low and golden, and the lake was completely silent except for the sound of small waves against the hull. Daniel caught 3 fish, and I caught 2. We talked about nothing important and everything real. He told me he had been thinking about how much I had sacrificed for him. He told me he understood it better now that he was older. He said he was sorry for the years of distance. I told him there was nothing to be sorry for. I believed it in that moment. I fully believed it. Then Daniel said he needed to use the restroom, and there was a spot back near the launch where he had seen a trail heading into the tree line. He said he would take the boat back in, tie it up, and walk to the trail. He said I should stay out and keep fishing, that he would be back in 10 minutes. He handed me an extra water bottle and the remaining snacks from the bag. He squeezed my shoulder and smiled and told me he was glad we had done this. I watched him start the motor. I watched him pilot the boat toward the shore. I watched the boat reach the launch and Daniel step off. And then I watched him do something that did not register as wrong for a full 30 seconds because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. He untied the boat from the cleat he had used to secure it temporarily, tied it instead to the roof of his truck using the lines I had seen him loading earlier, put the truck in gear, and began driving away. He did not look back. I was standing in water that was ankle-deep because I had moved toward a rocky outcrop near the edge of the lake not long before. The water was cold enough that I could already feel it through my boots. The boat was gone. The truck was gone. My son was gone. My phone, which I had left in the cup holder of the boat because Daniel had told me to leave it there so it did not get wet, was gone. My jacket, the one with the emergency whistle and the folding knife in the pocket, was in the truck. What I had was a fishing rod, 2 water bottles, a half-empty bag of trail mix, the clothes on my back, and a life jacket. For the first few minutes, I could not process it. My brain kept cycling through explanations. Maybe he was moving the truck to a better spot. Maybe there was an emergency and he would be back in moments. Maybe there was something wrong with the boat and he needed to move it. I stood at the edge of the water and I waited. I waited for 20 minutes, then 30, then an hour. The sun was moving lower. The temperature was dropping. The forest around the lake was entirely silent except for the occasional sound of a bird. And then the cold got deep enough into my feet that it pushed past the shock, and I finally understood with complete clarity that my son had left me here on purpose. I will not pretend that the next several hours were anything other than the most frightening of my life. I am 61 years old. I have a heart condition. I was standing on the bank of a remote lake in late October with no phone, no shelter, no map, no fire-starting equipment, and no way to signal anyone. The logging road that had brought us in was visible from the far side of the lake, but the far side of the lake was at least a mile of shoreline walking through dense brush and fallen timber. I had to make a decision, and I had to make it quickly before the light was gone entirely. I made that walk in just under 2 hours. I fell 3 times. My hands were cut from grabbing at branches in the dark sections under the canopy. At one point, I sat down on a rock and told myself I needed to breathe. That panic would kill me faster than the cold, and I sat there with my eyes closed for 3 full minutes doing the kind of slow, measured breathing my doctor had taught me to manage my heart rate under stress. Then I got up and kept moving. I reached the gravel clearing just before the light was completely gone. The truck was obviously not there. But someone had been there after Daniel left because there was a folding knife on the ground near the launch, a cheap one with an orange handle, the kind hunters carry as spares. To this day, I do not know how it got there. Maybe it fell from a pocket. Maybe it was left weeks ago. But I took it as the small miracle it was, and I used it over the next hour to cut branches and build enough of a windbreak against the rear of a large boulder to get out of the worst of the cold. I will not detail every hour of that night because this story is not really about the wilderness. The wilderness was the method. The real story was what was happening back in the world while I sat behind a boulder on a gravel clearing in a national forest with no way to reach anyone. What I learned later, piece by piece, through conversations and documents and a few carefully placed phone calls, was that Daniel had already set several things in motion before he took me on that trip. He had met 3 more times with the attorney Gerald Marsh after my second visit to that office. He had begun the process of having me evaluated for a capacity determination, a legal procedure used when a family member believes an older person is no longer capable of managing their own affairs. He had collected statements from 2 people, one of whom I had never heard of, and one of whom was a former colleague of mine he had apparently contacted through my old workplace, suggesting that I had displayed signs of confusion and erratic financial decision-making over the previous year. He had also contacted my bank about the procedures for accessing an account when the account holder was deceased or incapacitated. He had not moved money yet. He was too careful for that. But he was building a case, and the case required my absence. A prolonged disappearance followed by a search, followed by a declaration of presumed death, would have started the clock on the trust. He had done the research. He knew exactly how long that process took and what it required. And he had done it all while calling me twice a week and telling me he loved me and planning a fishing trip. I was found the next morning by a hunter who had come out early to set a blind near the lake. He heard me calling from the clearing at first light. He had a truck, a CB radio, and the kind of no-nonsense competence that only comes from spending real time in real wilderness. He got me warm, got me water, and drove me to the nearest town with cell service in under 40 minutes. The first call I made was to Margaret, not to Daniel, not to any other family member. To Margaret because she was the one person in my life I was certain was on my side. Margaret answered on the second ring. I told her where I had been and what had happened. She was silent for a long moment, and then she said 3 words I will never forget. She said, "I know Noah." She had suspected something was wrong from the moment Daniel had come to my house 3 days before the trip and spent an unusually long time in my driveway. She had written down the date and time in the small notebook she kept on her kitchen counter. She had a habit of doing that, writing things down. I have never been more grateful for anyone's habits in my entire life. I did not go home immediately. The hunter, whose name was Carl, drove me to the small clinic in town where a doctor checked me over. Minor hypothermia, some cuts, elevated blood pressure that needed monitoring. Nothing that required hospitalization, which was both a relief and important because I needed to think before I appeared anywhere public. I needed to understand what I was walking back into before I walked back into it. I borrowed Carl's phone and I called an attorney. Not Gerald Marsh. A different attorney, one whose name I had written in a small address book I kept in my shirt pocket, a habit from before smartphones, one that had survived the fishing trip because it was in my shirt pocket and not the jacket I had left in Daniel's truck. The attorney's name was Patricia Holt. I had met her at a community event 8 months earlier, and something about her directness had made me keep her card, even though I had told myself at the time that I did not need an attorney of my own. I had been wrong about that. I had been wrong about a lot of things. Patricia Holt was in her office when I called. I told her I had a situation that was urgent and unusual. She told me to come in the following morning and to bring any documents I had access to. I told her I did not have documents at the moment because I had just spent a night on the bank of a wilderness lake. She paused for exactly 3 seconds and then she said, "Then I'll start pulling public records tonight. I'll have something for you by the time you arrive." That was the moment I understood that things were about to change in a way they could not be undone. I spent that night at a motel in the small town where Carl had brought me. I did not call Daniel. I did not call anyone in my extended family. I turned the television on low and I sat on the edge of the motel bed and I thought about my life with a clarity that grief and shock and cold will sometimes give a person if they survive them. I thought about every warning I had ignored, every explanation I had chosen that was generous to Daniel instead of accurate. Every time I had told myself I was being paranoid and chosen loyalty over observation. I thought about Margaret and her notebook. I thought about the attorney and the capacity determination process. I thought about Gerald Marsh and the way he had asked about the timeline on my trust. I did not cry that night. I had cried for Daniel before, years earlier, during the long, quiet years when he would go months without calling, and I would sit with the specific kind of loneliness that only a parent abandoned by a grown child can understand. I had used up those tears already. What I felt that night was not grief. It was the particular cold clarity of a man who has finally allowed himself to see the truth without flinching away from it. It was not a comfortable feeling, but it was a real one. And it was the feeling that would carry me through everything that came next. Patricia Holt's office was in a city 2 hours south. I took a bus because I had no car and I did not want to borrow Carl's again, though he had offered without hesitation. The bus ride gave me time to organize my thoughts. I went over every financial decision I had made in the past 2 years, every conversation with Daniel about money, every meeting with Gerald Marsh. Every moment that had felt slightly off but that I had chosen to reframe as something harmless. Patricia met me at the door herself. She was a small, serious woman in her late 50s with the kind of measured energy that comes from decades of dealing with situations where emotion is useful only if it is controlled. She shook my hand, looked me over, and said, "You look like you had a hard night." I said, "Too, actually." She nodded and led me inside. what she had already pulled in the hours since my call was more significant than I had expected. She had found the petition that had been filed under my name at the county probate court. It was a capacity hearing request filed by Daniel, citing concern about my ability to manage my own financial affairs due to medical decline. It had been filed 11 days earlier. The hearing date had been set for 3 weeks from the day I was sitting in her office. There was a supporting statement from Gerald Marsh attached to the filing, in which he described 2 meetings with me in which I had displayed, in his professional opinion, signs of confusion and inability to track complex financial information. I sat with that document for a long time. I read it carefully. I read Marsh's description of me, and I recognized myself in it in the way you might recognize yourself in a funhouse mirror. The proportions were wrong. The shape was distorted. But you could see the outline of the real thing underneath, twisted to serve a different purpose. Patricia said, "The good news is that you're alive, you're clearly competent, and this filing is based entirely on testimony from your son and an attorney who has a direct financial relationship with your son's estate planning. The bad news is that the process was already in motion. If you had remained missing for another 2 to 3 weeks, the timeline would have started to shift significantly." She then told me something that I had not known before I walked into her office. Daniel had also made a quiet inquiry to the outfitter from whom he had rented the boat, asking about the process for reporting a boating accident and what documentation was typically required. He had asked this question 4 days before our trip. The outfitter's staff member who had handled the inquiry had made a note in the rental file because the question had struck her as unusual. That note was still in the file. Patricia had a contact at the outfitter's company through a previous case. That note changed everything. It was not a confession. It was not a crime in itself, but it established intent. It established that Daniel had been thinking about what to do after I went missing before he had taken me anywhere. It was the kind of detail that a capacity hearing, a civil proceeding, a family court, or a police report would find very difficult to explain away. I spent 3 hours with Patricia that first morning. By the time I left, we had a plan. It was not a dramatic plan. It was not a screaming match or a public confrontation or a family meeting where I laid out the evidence and watched everyone react. It was a quiet, methodical, legal plan built around 3 things: documentation, timing, and protection. The first step was to secure my assets. Patricia filed an emergency motion with the probate court that same afternoon, appearing on my behalf and presenting me as the subject of the capacity petition, alive, present, coherent, and represented by counsel. The petition was suspended pending a full hearing. Gerald Marsh was notified. Daniel was notified. I can only imagine what that moment was like for both of them. The second step was to revise my trust immediately. I had the legal right to do this at any time while I was living and competent. We drafted the revised document that day. The new version removed Daniel as the sole beneficiary and restructured the distribution of my assets in a way that reflected my actual wishes, not the ones Daniel had been planning around. I will not detail the exact terms here, but I will say that Daniel's share became significantly smaller and significantly more conditional than it had ever been before. The third step was to document the events of the fishing trip as formally as possible. I gave a detailed written statement to Patricia, who also arranged for me to speak with a detective from the county sheriff's office. A quiet conversation in which I described what had happened at the lake without emotion and with as much specificity as I could provide. The detective took notes. He did not make promises, but he took notes, and he asked follow-up questions, and he asked for Carl's contact information, which I provided. Through all of this, I did not contact Daniel. I had nothing to say to him that would be useful at that moment, and I was not willing to give him information about my movements or my thinking. He did not know where I was. He did not know whether I had survived. That uncertainty was, for a brief window, the only leverage I had, and I was not going to waste it. On the fourth day after the fishing trip, Margaret called me on the phone I had purchased at a small electronics shop in the town where Patricia's office was located. Margaret told me that Daniel had come to my house the previous afternoon. She had watched from her window. He had walked around the exterior as she had described before. Then he had tried the front door. Then he had gone to the back and tried that door. Then he had sat in his truck in my driveway for over an hour before driving away. She had written down the time he arrived and the time he left and taken a photograph of his truck in the driveway from her upstairs window because Margaret was exactly that kind of woman. I asked her to keep that photograph and the notebook. She said, "Already done, Noah?" Then she asked me if I was eating and sleeping. I told her I was trying. She told me to try harder. That was Margaret. On the sixth day, I returned home. I want to be precise about this because the manner of my return mattered. I did not sneak in. I did not hide. I drove up to my own house in a car I had rented in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and I walked to my front door with my key, and I let myself in, and I called a locksmith to change the locks that same afternoon because there was a spare key to my house in a drawer in the kitchen that Daniel had been given years ago and that I had never asked him to return. The locksmith had barely finished when my phone rang. It was Daniel. I did not answer. He called again. I did not answer. He sent a text message that said, "Dad, I've been worried sick. Where are you? Please call me." I read it and put the phone face down on the counter and went to make myself a cup of tea. He drove to my house that evening. I watched through the front window as he knocked. I watched his face when there was no answer. He did not look like a worried son. He looked like a man calculating. His jaw was tight and his eyes were moving in the way they do when someone is doing math they did not expect to have to do. He knocked again. He looked up at the windows. He saw the light on in the kitchen. He knew I was there. I opened the door. I did not invite him in. I stood in the doorway and looked at my son in a way that I had never looked at him before, without apology and without the reflexive warmth I had always carried for him, the warmth I had maintained even during all the years of distance and disappointment, the warmth that had been one of my greatest vulnerabilities. Daniel stared at me for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, thank God, I've been going out of my mind. I didn't know what happened." I said nothing. He said, "The boat drifted. I tried to get back to you and I couldn't get the engine started again and I had to walk out, and by the time I could get back it was too dark and I had no idea where you were. I called search and rescue. I filed a report." I said, "I know you filed a report, Daniel." He paused. I said, "I also know you asked the outfitter about the accident documentation process 4 days before we left. I know about the capacity petition. I know about Gerald Marsh. And I know that the trust has already been revised." He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, you don't understand." I said, "I understand everything." I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not list every item of evidence or explain every step of what I had done. I simply told him that my attorney would be in contact with him and that he should make sure he had legal representation before that call came. Then I stepped back and I closed the door. That was the climax, not a screaming match, not a public confrontation, not a dramatic collapse on either side. It was a door closing quietly on a chapter that had taken 61 years of my life to end. The legal process that followed was not simple or fast, but it was steady. The capacity petition was formally dismissed after my appearance at the hearing, at which I presented myself, answered questions from the court without confusion or difficulty, and watched Gerald Marsh leave the room without making eye contact with me. Daniel had retained his own attorney by then, a fact that was both predictable and clarifying. The outfitter's note about the accident documentation inquiry was entered into the record as part of a separate investigation that the county detective had opened based on my statement. The investigation did not result in criminal charges, partly because the legal bar for proving intent in a situation like mine is high, and partly because my attorney advised me that the civil route was more reliable and more likely to produce the outcome I actually wanted. What I wanted was not to see my son in prison. I want to be honest about that because some people hear this story and expect a more dramatic punishment. What I wanted was protection. I wanted my assets protected. I wanted my legal standing protected. I wanted the truth on record in a way that could not be undone or revised by Daniel or Gerald Marsh or anyone else. I wanted a documented account of what had been attempted, so that if anything happened to me in the future, there was a paper trail that could not be ignored. All of those things happened. The revised trust stood. My financial accounts were secured with updated authorization requirements that required two-factor verification for any changes. Gerald Marsh was reported to the state bar for his role in the capacity petition filing, a filing that had relied on fabricated or significantly distorted observations. The bar opened an investigation. I do not know its outcome as of the time I am telling you this story, but I know the investigation exists. Daniel's landscaping business, which had relied on a line of credit that was connected to my co-signed loan from years earlier, became complicated when the terms of that loan were reviewed in light of changed circumstances. I did not actively try to damage his business, but I also did not continue to protect financial arrangements that had been built on a foundation of manipulation. I let the bank handle the review according to their own processes. The result was that Daniel had to renegotiate the line of credit without my backing, which changed his financial position significantly. He tried to reach me several times over the months following the confrontation. Some attempts were emotional, texts and voicemails in which he described how much he regretted everything, how he had made terrible choices from a place of fear about my health and his own financial instability, how he loved me and wanted the chance to rebuild what we had. I read the messages. I listened to the voicemails. I felt something when I listened to them, not warmth, not the old reflexive love, but something closer to grief. The grief of finally accepting that the version of Daniel I had spent decades hoping for was never going to arrive. Other attempts were more transactional. His attorney contacted Patricia about the trust revision, suggesting that Daniel had legal standing to contest it. Patricia informed them that the grounds for such a contest were weak, and that pursuing it would require Daniel to submit himself to depositions in which the capacity petition, the outfitter's note, and the events of the fishing trip would all become part of the record in a civil proceeding. Daniel's attorney withdrew the suggestion. Margaret came over for tea every Thursday. She brought her notebook every time. She never once said, "I told you so," which was a form of kindness I have rarely encountered in my life and which I will carry with me until the end of it. About 8 months after the fishing trip, I received a letter from Daniel. Not a text, not a voicemail, a handwritten letter sent through the mail. I sat with it for 2 days before I opened it. The letter was 4 pages long, written in the unsteady handwriting of a person who had been crying while they wrote. He described the fear that had been driving him in the months before the trip. He described the business debt he had been hiding from me, debt that was significantly worse than I had known. He described the conversations with Gerald Marsh that had started as estate planning advice and had gradually become something else, something he had convinced himself was practical, but that he now understood was monstrous. He wrote that he had told himself I was dying anyway, that the heart condition would take me within a few years, that he was only accelerating a timeline that was already inevitable. He wrote that writing those words down was the first time he had seen them clearly enough to understand what they meant. I read the letter 3 times. Then I placed it in the folder that Patricia had created for the documentation of the case, because even that letter, as painful as it was to read, was a document. It was a record. In a better version of the world, it might have been the beginning of a conversation. In the version of the world I actually lived in, it was evidence. I did not write back. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned by that point that my words, my warmth, my responses had historically been Daniel's entry point for the next request, the next manipulation, the next chapter of a dynamic that had been unhealthy for far longer than I had admitted. The kindest thing I could do for both of us was to offer him silence, not cruelty, not permanent erasure. Just silence and time, and the knowledge that what had been built between us over the previous 2 years could not be rebuilt in a letter. Carl, the hunter who had found me that morning on the lake shore, became someone I spoke with once a month by phone. He was a quiet, practical man who had spent 40 years in the wilderness and had developed the kind of clear-eyed perspective on human nature that comes from spending a lot of time away from it. He told me once that the worst thing about the wilderness was not the cold or the animals or the weather. He said the worst thing was that it did not care about your feelings. It simply presented conditions, and you either adapted to them or you did not. He said he thought that most of the trouble in human life came from people refusing to do what the wilderness demanded, which was to see the conditions as they actually were, not as you wished them to be. I thought about that a lot during the months of rebuilding. Not rebuilding a relationship with Daniel, but rebuilding myself. Rebuilding a life that was mine, built around what I actually valued rather than around the maintenance of a dynamic that had been costing me more than I had ever acknowledged. I started fishing again, not at that lake. A different one, close to home, quiet and accessible. I went alone most mornings when the weather was good, and I sat in a small rented rowboat, and I let the silence do what silence does when you finally stop fighting it. I let it be present without trying to fill it. My doctor was pleased with my cardiac numbers at the follow-up appointment 8 months post-trip. She said the changes I had made, the reduced stress, the regular exercise, the better sleep that came from not lying awake worrying about a relationship I could not fix, had made a measurable difference in my health markers. She said with a slight smile that whatever I was doing, I should keep doing it. I thought about all the years I had spent managing distance and disappointment, and the particular exhaustion of loving someone who could not love you back without conditions. I thought about how much energy that management had taken, energy that had not been available for anything else, energy that, now that I was not spending it on Daniel, was coming back to me in ways I had not expected. I started drawing again, something I had done as a young man and had completely abandoned. I started cooking properly instead of the quick meals of someone who ate alone out of obligation rather than pleasure. I started going to a weekly dinner at a community hall near my neighborhood, a thing I had avoided for years because going alone felt like an admission of something I was not ready to admit. At one of those dinners, about a year after the fishing trip, I sat next to a man named Warren who was also retired, also a widower by circumstance rather than death, and also someone who had spent more years than he should have holding on to a relationship that had not deserved his loyalty. We did not talk about any of that on the first dinner. We talked about the food and the neighborhood and the general state of winter in the Pacific Northwest. But we kept sitting next to each other at the following dinners, and gradually over weeks and months we talked about everything else. I do not know what the future looks like. I am 62 now. My health is managed. My finances are protected. My home is mine in a way it has never fully felt before, not because I changed anything structural about it, but because I changed something internal about the way I lived inside it. I stopped organizing my life around someone else's crisis. I stopped spending my peace to buy someone else's approval. I stopped choosing explanations that were generous to the people causing the damage rather than accurate about what was actually happening. I do not hate Daniel. That is the truth, and I say it without performance. Hate requires a kind of ongoing engagement with the person you hate, a continuous investment in their power over you, and I am no longer investing in Daniel's power over anything. What I feel is something quieter and I think more honest. I feel the particular sadness of a man who gave his best to a relationship that was never what he believed it was, and who survived long enough to understand that clearly, and who chose, in the end, to build something real from whatever was left. The wilderness did not kill me. The cold did not kill me. My son's plan did not kill me. And the betrayal, as deep and thorough as it was, did not kill me either. What it did was finally give me permission I should have given myself years earlier to stop waiting for someone else to decide whether my life had value. I already knew the answer. I had always known it. I had just been too busy being a loyal father to act on it. I am Noah. I am 62 years old. I survived a wilderness night with a folding knife and a life jacket and the slow breathing my doctor taught me. I came home and I changed the locks and I revised the trust and I told the truth to people who needed to hear it. I did not raise my voice. I did not lose control. I did not beg anyone to understand what had been done to me or to feel sorry for me or to choose my side. I just stopped being available for a dynamic that had been quietly killing me for far longer than one night on a lake. And that, more than anything else that happened, is the thing that saved my life. If you made it to the end of Noah's story, then you already know that the most powerful thing a person can do after being betrayed is not to explode. It is to get quiet, get smart, and get protected. If this story hit something real for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment in this story that broke you the most? Was it the boat, the capacity petition, the letter, or the part where Noah finally closed the door? I read every comment. And if you have a story of your own that deserves to be heard, drop it below. You are not alone.